Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to recognize Jim Wynn, his wife Elizabeth, and daughter Molly. Jim is a member of our Board of Trustees here at the Marshall Foundation, but perhaps more importantly, he is General Marshall's grandson. Throughout the evening, you will hear many mentions of the Wynn collection, which is Jim's. We've been helping Jim with the cataloging of that collection, and we know that this newly revealed collection will be a stunning addition to the catalog of Marshall documents and artifacts that already exists. And we have no doubt that this collection will help create new scholarship and new insights into Marshall's life. We're deeply grateful to Jim and his family for the opportunity to work with the collection. Tonight's speaker has had the wonderful opportunity to spend the entire summer working in the Wynn collection. Adrian Brettle is a graduate student at the University of Virginia, where he's studying for his PhD in history. And as you will hear in a few minutes, Adrian brings an historian's eye for detail and clarity to his work on the collection. Adrian received his BA and MA from Pembroke College and Cambridge University, which will become immediately evident as soon as he opens his mouth, before coming to the University of Virginia. While at UVA, Adrian has been a course instructor and a graduate teaching assistant, as well as conducting research on a variety of topics in his field, which include medieval Europe, modern Britain, and 18th to 20th century U.S. history. Prior to coming to the U.S., Adrian was the founder and chairperson of the Balfour Group, a discussion group of 50 national politicians, journalists, academics, and business people who meet quarterly to produce papers that contribute to the ongoing political debate in Great Britain. Please welcome Adrian Brettle.
Thank you, Brian, for your kind words this evening. And I'd also like to take this opportunity of thanking both the Institute of Public History at the University of Virginia and the Marshall Foundation for making possible the internship I did here over the summer in the library, and even more to Mr. James J. Wynn Jr. for making this archive a reality. In the limited time available, I cannot possibly do this amazing collection justice. All I can do is highlight an aspect of it. The theme I have chosen for today's presentation, I hope, will illuminate what I think are two essential attributes of a Wynn collection. One, that whilst it contains important documents relating to Marshall's public career after 1939, arguably more significant is the new material relating to Marshall's earlier, more formative developmental years. Two, the Wynn collection has an emphasis on what can be described as Marshall's private office. For example, whilst it contains official documents, these tend to relate to Marshall's career progression rather than about Marshall's official position at the time. Hence my theme this evening is one of personal development, and how Marshall used professional experience to develop his personal attributes and vice versa. But at the same time, the boundary between the public man and the private individual was something Marshall sought to manage. Therefore, the papers in the Wynn collection reveal an inevitable friction between the public and the private. And I will discuss this evening how it was Marshall's quest to minimize this tension by, I argue, placing his private existence in service of, rather than in conflict with, his public life. To achieve this feat required a superhuman effort from Marshall, and I believe helps to explain his extraordinary success and contribution to both the history of both the United States and the world. The collection records an early and continuing example of Marshall's success in blurring the public and the private, which was in using his official duties to satisfy his love of travel. Between 1913 and 1916, Marshall was on duty in the Philippines, serving as ADC, aide-de-camp, to Major General Hunter Liggett, commander of the Department of the Philippines. As part of his official duties in 1914, Marshall went to China and Korea to inspect the places where Russia and Japan had earlier clashed in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. So, in the Wynne collection's pre-World War I subgroup is found, addressed to the department, Marshall's, quote, report of visit to Manchurian battlefields with recommendations, end quote. So there was an avowed military purpose in this trip. What lessons could be learnt for the American Army, in particular with regard to the perceived increasing vulnerability of the garrison in the Philippines to Japanese assault as early as 1914. Japan's earlier decisive defeat of a much superior power, Imperial Russia, was held to have lasting significance militarily. However, there was also a historical purpose to Marshall's visit, as seen in a title of another account in the Wynne collection called, quote, Forgotten Scenes of Heroism, end quote. The Russo-Japanese War had been over almost 10 years, and subsequent events were already overshadowing its significance. By 1914, for example, the Chinese Empire had ceased to be, and war was on the verge of breaking out in Europe. Marshall, therefore, had a historical eye for wanting to use his position to capture events, to capture aspects of that earlier conflict before they were lost forever. Finally, on the same visit, there were taken copious photographs, now in the collection, showing Marshall finding time to be both tourist and avid hunter. So in one visit, Marshall was able to combine his military expertise, historical awareness, and indulge his hobbies. Moreover, Marshall's love of travel continued in his later, more exalted position as ADC to the shortly to be General of the Armies, John Joseph Pershing. In the summer of 1919, Marshall kept a periodic diary for the benefit of the first Mrs. Marshall. The diary was composed to cover the times when he accompanied General Pershing on his official visits to England, Italy, and the battlefields of the Western Front in France. Marshall records meeting, amongst others, Winston Churchill, who in 1919 was already famous as Secretary for War in the coalition led by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Marshall captured a typical remark as Churchill observed the parading of the soon-to-be departing American troops. He told Marshall, in reference to the passage of the 18th Amendment earlier that year, never had he seen so many fine young men gathered together in one place who will never have another drink. A social side to Marshall does emerge from these pages. As well as meeting the key figures of military and government, Marshall also squeezed in receptions with the leading hostesses of the era, especially those such as the Lady Curzon, the former Miss Grace Elvina Triller Hines, daughter of Joseph Monroe Hines, at one time US Minister in Brazil, and Lady Astor, the former Miss Nancy Langhorne of Mirador, which I passed on the way here from Charlottesville, ladies who were of American extraction. Moreover, Marshall's diary captures an historical moment, that era of momentary confidence. President Woodrow Wilson was at the very same moment presenting the Versailles Treaty to the Senate, when the United States international prestige was high. So Marshall, as well as amusing his wife, and doing his job, was also recording for posterity a key moment in world history, and also, at the same time, providing a lesson to us in stamina, how to go to multiple parties and get by on astonishingly little sleep. But there were other occasions when the personal and the professional existences were not so harmonious. In the Marshall's correspondence group of a Wing collection, we find Marshall, as Chief of Staff, having to cope with the personal consequences of his official position. Both of his stepsons, Clifton and Alan Brown, had opted, with no prompting from Marshall, into the army. Marshall wished his sons to advance, but without being seen to depend for this on him. To this end, in the training school, it was critical that their relationship be kept a secret. Now, of course, in the preservation of secrecy, Marshall was helped by their different surname. But hence the anguish he felt when, inevitably perhaps, he got a letter out of the blue from the commandant of the training school inviting Marshall to the graduation to see your stepsons. The cover was blown. Marshall was happy to assist his stepsons if they requested it, but not otherwise. The Wynne collection shows that Marshall detested anything covert. A kinsman of his first wife, Colonel Edmund P. Coles, was a friend who organised shooting parties. Now, shooting was one of the few forms of relaxation Marshall allowed himself once he was Chief of Staff. But he felt compelled to warn Coles after one of the guns whom he met on the latest shoot had presumed on the introduction to subsequently call on him in Washington asking for promotion for his son. Marshall told Coles to be more careful about whom he asked on shoots in future if he, Marshall, was to attend. But at the same time, Marshall balanced this distance in some circumstances with doing everything he could on other more appropriate occasions. For example, when a friend's son is missing in action, Marshall rapidly moves to use all his influence to get a speedy update on the situation. Therefore, Marshall had developed, by his Chief of Staff years, a clear understanding of what was acceptable and unacceptable. Perhaps he learnt the skill of preserving friendships whilst avoiding conflicts of interest by his dual role as friend and military subordinate to Pershing. As his ADC, Marshall's devotion was absolute. In the collection, there is preserved the careful phrasing of, quote, memoranda on suggestions on items to be included in Pershing's final report as Chief of Staff, end quote. But it is striking that even after he left Pershing's side as ADC, and the latter had retired, that Pershing continued to loom large in Marshall's life. When on duty with the 15th Infantry in Tientsin, China in the mid-1920s, the bulk of the Wing collection for those years is a subject file entitled, you guessed it, Pershing's Memoirs. But note, though, that Marshall still had time to earn plaudits from his commanding officers for his course that he devised in Chinese. And even later, Marshall would drop everything, announced with a telegram message to Pershing of standing by and awaiting orders, and rushed to Washington when he was assistant commandant at the infantry school in Fort Benning, Georgia. Why did he do this? The reason: to do 48 hours solid proofreading to meet a deadline to ensure timely publication of Pershing's, quote, My Experiences in the World War, end quote, in 1931, which, as it happened, won the Pulitzer Prize for History. Despite Pershing's triumph in his memoirs and Marshall's own role in its success, he was never tempted to write his own memoirs. The Wynne collection may shed light on one of the reasons. Marshall may have refused on the grounds of some professional reactions to Pershing's own memoirs. In the Fort Benning correspondence of the collection, Marshall had to deal with a complaint from the then Chief of Infantry, Major General Stephen O. Fuqua. Pardon me if I pronounce that wrong. In Pershing's account, Marshall is credited, and for Fuqua too credited, with a pivotal role in the movement of troops preparatory to both the St. Michel and Meuse-Argonne offensives in 1918. And the collection has the exchange of letters between the two. And in reply, Marshall had to negotiate a fine line between his loyalty to Pershing on the one hand and the need to placate a superior officer on the other. Now, the exchange was detailed and I believe will be of great use to military historians of the American offensives in World War I. But more than that, the exchange of letters also sheds light on the nature of the US military between the wars. The rest of the Benning correspondence in the Wynne collection also illuminates this, when the legacy of World War I was an overlarge officer corps with not enough positions for them to fill, and promotion only when another retires. So what Marshall had to do in his replies was above all restrain any frustration he may have felt. Fuqua was described in the Arlington Cemetery website as, quote, squat and solid, end quote. I'm just suggesting that possibly inferior minds were progressing whilst his career was stuck in the doldrums. Also, Marshall was so clearly Pershing's man, and he returned the latter's praise. In the Benning portion of the collection is an article by Marshall entitled, quote, How Pershing Met Crisis of Meuse-Argonne, end quote. Now, perhaps this connection placed obstacles in Marshall's path of forming friendships with his direct contemporaries in the army. Marshall seemed to get on much better with superiors and subordinates. But this is not to say that the collection demonstrates that Marshall had difficulty in making friends. Far from it. Later material, for example, reinforces the close relationship he forged as Chief of Staff with key British civilian and military personnel during World War II. For example, the British ambassador and his wife, Lord and Lady Halifax. Interestingly, a significant theme in all the correspondence of the Wynne collection is how Marshall also wrote to the wives of his opposite numbers and military colleagues. But the closest friends of all were firstly with Sir John Grier Dill, head of the Joint Staff Mission and senior British member of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and secondly, his civilian boss, Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson. The collection shows that Marshall negotiated military-civilian and international relations with customary delicacy. It is important to note that Marshall made personal friends of professional acquaintances, although we all know the distance he placed carefully between himself and FDR. But the collection shows how, as long as his own role was not compromised, and indeed would be benefited, Marshall made friends. He and the second Mrs. Marshall would, for example, speedily arrange informal dinners for exiled Britons in wartime Washington. It is surely significant that the Wynne collection tells us that as Secretary of State, with other matters to occupy his time, Marshall would, on a later visit to London, find the time to dine with the widowed Lady Dill. Marshall's success in blurring the professional with the personal meant that sometimes to observers, all his associations were seen as professional. And I think this connects to another theme that runs through the extensive correspondence in the collection, and that is that Marshall was only too well aware of his reputation as a workaholic, going right back to the beginning of his career. The consequence of his label was that his friends, and even relations, were increasingly reluctant to write or call on him for fear of interrupting and increasing his workload. Hence we have a bizarre situation repeated over and over in the correspondence of Marshall having to write to people complaining that he had not heard from them for so long. Marshall could achieve this feat of always having sufficient time in the day to write even when so much busier than the neglectful recipient, in part because of a trend in the Wynne collection, which is the development of a private office. And the second Mrs. Marshall is central here. The scrapbooks alone in the collection are a testament to her skills as organiser, cataloguer and secretary. There were also a succession of more formal secretaries who seemed, in particular Frank McCarthy, to become quasi-family and exceedingly loyal to Marshall. The loyalty was reciprocated. Letters of recommendation from Marshall of former secretaries back to World War I are a feature of the Wynne collection. But there was another factor. Marshall's discipline, his ability to get the most out of each day, can explain so much. We all know about his sleeping regime and riding out, for example, but the collection also shows that Marshall was a voracious reader, again indulging in something he could treat as a leisure activity, but resulted in professional development. Again, I argue he expanded the professional day by blurring it so skillfully with his private existence. Military and political history featured prominently, but his bedside table, judging from the correspondence in the collection, also has space for fiction works as well. Marshall did not restrict himself to a historical diet. For the collection also shows how Marshall assiduously kept himself up to date on the latest advances in military thought and training. Interestingly, German and Japanese visitors, the innovative powers of the time, passed through his correspondence of the 1920s and 1930s. One can conclude from a review of the Wynne collection that as far as Marshall was concerned, the military were not enduring a static breathing space in the United States between World War I and World War II. The foundation for this later military expertise Marshall demonstrated was his hard work in World War I. The collection shows that Marshall attained a mastery of the American Army's experience of World War I, but also how that could be put to use for the future. The reports he prepared as Assistant Chief of Staff and Chief of Staff First Army, and their accompanying maps, will be an extraordinary resource for researchers in the collection. But Marshall lectured after the war, no doubt at Army War College, on the experience and lessons to be gained from World War I. For Marshall, for all his fascination with military history, was determined to get out from the war's shadow. For example, Marshall was certainly interested in tactical innovations. The collection contains memoranda on the uses of machine guns, mobilization and movement of armies by rail, anti-aircraft instruction for rifle units, and actually the parade ground photographs, in addition, show exercises deploying state-of-the-art tanks in the mid-1930s. But what the Wynne collection really signifies are the broader considerations of a relationship between the army and society, which again brings into focus the military-civilian relationship predicated on Marshall's own management of his personal and professional roles. As commander in Fort Scriven in 1932-33, Marshall was instructing his officers to grapple with the problem of the employment of federal troops in domestic disturbances. And moreover, he composed a questionnaire on the employment of federal troops to prevent and suppress domestic disturbances. So hot topics. The latter was developed in an even hotter time, as an even hotter topic, in November 1932. It is impossible not to conclude that Marshall understood that, from the popular viewpoint, General Douglas MacArthur's period as Chief of Staff was remembered chiefly for the cavalry sabre-induced eviction of the bonus army of jobless veterans from Washington in the summer of 1932. Now, this legacy may have been the wrong conclusion of MacArthur's time, but these popular perceptions mattered to Marshall. But Marshall was not only sensitive to the public opinion of the moment. Marshall rather had a long-term approach to the role of the army in society at large, which went back to the end of World War I. For example, the Wynne collection includes a draft of a speech given at the War College to mark Marshall's third year as Pershing's ADC in 1922, and in which Marshall considers the development of a national army. And Marshall's time at Fort Benning at the end of the decade was a time when he was considering more broadly matters of research on military education, culminating when commander at Fort Scriven in his time on the advisory committee of the Civilian Military Education Fund. Marshall had a clear understanding that the army must not become an isolated officer corps, but needed to remain embedded in and subordinate to the civilian world. And this was at a time when pressures for disarmament were increasing, so the army's very existence was held by Marshall to be dependent upon civilian support. It was in this understanding of this deference to civilian power, and hence in the soldier's concept of public duty, that the Wynne collection is an invaluable resource. Marshall held this axiom to the end of his career and beyond. In the Marshall's correspondence group within the Wynne collection are folders of 488 autograph requests and some 231 replies to birthday wishes on Marshall's 70th and 75th anniversaries. And this was at a time when Marshall's celebrity and status were at their peak. Yet even then, and like the then obscure officer of the 1920s and 30s, Marshall was only conscious of his subordination to the civilian world. Hence his punctilious responses to these public importunities. The preservation of these requests within the Wynne collection provides a fascinating insight into the world of the 1950s. But it also shows, even in retirement, that Marshall never lost sight of for whom he always worked, the American people. And this devotion to duty never left him to the very end. To bring it round to the theme of the talk, this was proof again that Marshall's private person was always at public service. Thank you for listening.